Okay, this is the start of Project 8, our last in the book. And one of the first things I want to do is I want to go over some basic things before you actually start in the chapter. I want to kind of familiarize you with some of the things that you're going to be encountering. So this is CSS grid response design, and this is some pretty important information that you're going to want to keep in mind in the process of designing the work in this chapter. You're going to be able to build a responsive web design page without using Bootstrap. It is more complex than Bootstrap in one respect, but it is also easier in another respect. And so if you can wade your way through this chapter and really understand what's going on, I would hope that you would spend quite a bit of time with this chapter, because this is the true meat and potato of how you get a website to stay in place and stick the pictures and everything to stick the way that you actually want them to stick, and have the ability to be able to understand totally what you're doing without bringing in a whole nother type of coding. So it's important that you try to really get a grasp on this chapter and really put your head into this chapter if you can. This is an excellent way to build a flexible grid because you use just HTML5 and CSS coding. And I'm going to say in the foreseeable future, these two types of coding will continue to be the solid base coding for all of web design. So it's important to really try to learn it. The major difference is understanding how this coding works differently, than Bootstrap version. With Bootstrap, the grid is built in HTML using this class element in CSS. In the CSS version, the flexible grid is built using CSS rules to define the flexible grid rows and columns along with media queries. Okay, so what I did next was I gave you an example of CSS grid response page coding basics. Okay, so on the HTML page, what you're going to see is the box, the div, and they gave it a class called text. And then, of course, you have the information that is seen by the viewer, and then the closing div tag. Now, the box has a .text class, and that's what you would write in your CSS coding is .text to start any rule that you would write for the div box. Okay, so then on the CSS page, one way to write it would be div.text. Then you open it up and then you say, okay, we're going to do a grid column and we're going to span it 12 rows. Okay, or I mean 12 columns. Okay, so that's how you would start it. And then you would add an at media, which means it would search the media of the device, and the minimum width, which in this case would be 992 pixels, which is a full-size desktop or a full-size laptop. Okay, so it would be a minimum width of 992 pixels. And that div text, you would want to span 6 columns. Okay, so that's what all of this coding says, and that's just a basic of a way that you could write a partial for responsive web design. Now let's talk about this a little bit more. It's important when building nested divs inside of a CSS grid to give each of the nested divs a unique class name, each one of them. The class names are used to define the size and position of each of the div elements. So this next session you will go through in the book defines the CSS grid container. Now, one of the things that they suggest is one of the ways you can do it is you can just say, okay, I just want to do it with 3 columns. And they say that that is not the best idea, that you should do a minimum of 6 and that you can do more than that. But I'm going to suggest that you not use more than 12 columns, period, just like you do in Bootstrap, because the more that you input, the more complex it gets, and 12 is going to be complex enough. Now, why you would want to use a minimum of 6? is it gives you more flexibility than 3 columns would. Now, if you take a look on this page, you'll see the 3 column one. Take a look at the image boxes, okay? You have the image on the left, the image on the right, and the image on the left, with no flexibility of changing how those boxes lay out. Now, you could do the same thing, which is the second series that you see there, with the image on the left, the image on the right, and the image on the left. But I want you to take a look at the third set of columns and how they made 2 of the image, 2 columns, and the third one is 3 columns. So I'm going to recommend that you put a minimum of 6 columns in when you're building one of these, not 3, for that very fact. Okay, let's move forward here. When defining actual column widths, you have several options for setting them up. And in this next section of the chapter, excuse me, we're going to be using what's called repeat value shorthand in the first part of the chapter. Let's talk about it a little bit, though. There are several ways that you can set it up. One of the ways is you could set specific sizes. The problem with specific sizes, so it doesn't allow for the column to change size when the display gets smaller or larger. So you really kind of limit yourself with setting actual pixel sizes. The second way is using fraction units, and it's not fractions like you think. If you use one fraction, it's going to be equal boxes all the way across. And for instance, it shows 3 fractions in the middle, which means it's 3 times bigger than the other 2 boxes. So it's a really, really easy way of setting it up to where it would be flexible, and that's what we're going to be using as we go through this. The third way is using auto, which allows a column to occupy whatever space is available. So if, for instance, if you set up 100 pixels on the left, auto in the middle, 100 pixels on the right, then whatever is left beyond the 200 pixels of the ones that are set would be what would be created in the middle. That can have some disastrous effects or some pretty decent effects depending on how big or how small the screen is. The last but not least is using a min-max value. Min-max means the minimum column width and the maximum column width, and that's another way of controlling how big or how small those columns will be. Now below that you're going to see grid template columns, 1FR, 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 1FR. That is one of the ways that you can set up making each column width the exact same width and how it's done. Now how they did for us, I want you to take a look at the top, was repeating. Okay, and it's going to repeat. The first parentheses is the repeat numbers, how many times it's going to repeat. And the second is the size of those columns. So it's going to repeat 6 times for 6 columns. Okay, and they're 1 fraction, which means it's going to be all the same size. So that is how we are going to set up a section of our coding. Note towards the bottom where it talks about the repeat and how I do blue arrows up there to remind you of how that works. Okay, read the fraction unit paragraph. Okay, it actually explains very clearly how fraction columns work, and you'll also notice above that there are several methods dividing everything up. Use the method that makes the most sense and works for you. I love how this next section in our book, you can plant elements so they do not jump around or act odd in a web page. One of the things in the process of learning how to design web pages from scratch without knowing a grid template is available like this is people have an issue with stuff jumping around and not staying put where they want it. So this really helps give us control over our web page. Any of you who have done previous HTML and CSS coding know exactly what I'm talking about. With the new CSS grid rules that were not available in the 2016 Dreamweaver book, it was just a nightmare. So this makes a lot more sense and is defined more professionally. One of the things I'm going to point out is doing this grid thing is there are actually 7 lines in 6 columns and 8 lines in 7 rows. Now if you scroll back up and take a look, oh no, it's going to be on the next page, sorry. You will see this is exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, here is 6 columns, but because they're boxes, you have to actually close the boxes. So there's a 7th line down the right hand side. Or look at the rows. Okay, there's 7 rows, but you've got to have an 8th line to close the last set of rows. So be aware that there's always going to be one more line on each side so you can plant things properly. Now let's talk about defining size and position of the CSS grid items. The concept of grid lines will become very important when it comes to positioning individual items in a grid. Consider the grid that you define for this project, which includes 6 columns and 7 rows. The illustration to the right here shows how the numbers work, okay, with the one greater than the number of columns and the one greater than the number of rows. Now remember, you need unique class names for these div box in order to do this, okay. For instance, let's say we want to do the logo, okay, so the grid row starts with 1 and ends with 2, so it's only going to cover 1 box. And the grid column, okay, so 1 and 2, so but the column is going to go from 1 to 7, so this logo is going to go all the way across this way, okay, all through all 6 columns, but only 1 as far as the height goes, and that's what this tells us, and that's how we can plan it. Now something else that you need to be very, very careful of, and I goofed up when I first started working this, was after you put in the grid row with the colon, okay, there are spaces in between each one of these. So there's a space 1, space, right slash, space 2. And so make sure that you put the spaces in between the numbers, and the slash is very, very important to do. So again, there are spaces in between those, and you're going to need to be very, very careful to make sure you get them in there. Another thing to be aware of is you can include 4 values in a single statement when writing a grid planting rule. Note in the bolded grid area towards the bottom, it tells you exactly what the numbers represents. Okay, first here's the name, okay, which you see in text 1 grid area. Okay, the first number here is the grid row start, so it's the 4th row. The second number is the grid column start, so it's the 3rd column over, and then we've got to end it. So then we've got the grid row end, which it goes down from 4 to 5, so it's actually 2 rows. And then the grid column end, which it's going to hit 7, which means it's going to fill the full 6 columns available, for instance, for this particular one. So it starts with column 4 and ends with column 6. So that's how you read that, and so remember that in the process of writing them. Also, again, just like with the other one, there are spaces between the numbers and between the slashes, so don't forget to put your spaces in when coding those. Okay, last but not least, one other thing we will be doing in this chapter is we're going to be including videos and a video in your web page. But you need to be aware that all browsers do not support all video types. And from what I'm seeing, okay, it looks like the MP4 format is going to be the best choice if you want to make sure that all browsers are able to read and play it. Okay, this was based on the 2019 book. I don't know if it's changed in 2020, but to be on the safe side, I would highly recommend, if you are building the videos, to convert them or make sure that they are in MP4 format prior to inputting them into your web page. Anyway, that covers some basic things that hopefully will make this chapter easier getting into it. It is a very complex chapter. The most important thing that I'm going to warn you of before, as you go through it, is make sure that your coding is correct. The worst thing that you're going to fight in this is a space or an error that won't make it work properly. Okay, let's get started.